Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Dave Watts, and I want to welcome you once again to the Church History Made Simple podcast. And we are coming to you live from the beautiful campus of Jimmy Swaggart Bible College, located here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. At this particular recording, it is a very rainy, humid day here. But we're glad to be here. We're glad you're here. This podcast is available on YouTube, available on Spotify, available on Apple Podcast, on iHeart Music, on just about every kind of platform. Amazon Music is about everything you can imagine, and even some that I wasn't even familiar with. But you can find that. The best way to find out information about the podcast in particular is to go to the Facebook page, Church History Made Simple with Dr. Watts, and you can see all of the links for where this is available. This is currently season 2. Season 2 is heavy themed on the Reformation. So we started off Part 1 and Part 2, the last 2 weeks, establishing the basis of the Reformation. Today, maybe just a little bit shorter, we are going to do a biographical overview of Martin Luther. We talked a little bit about him the last 2 weeks, but we need to talk specifically about the man. So if you are not a Luther fan, don't worry. We'll also be talking about Calvin. We'll also be talking about a lot of different figures this season. So just hang on with me. But Luther was such a pivotal figure that we need to talk about him and establish some things about his life and his ministry. Martin Luther lived from 1483 to 1546. He's considered the father of the Reformation, which transformed not only Christianity, but all of Western civilization. The Reformation was not just a religious movement, but a political movement. It literally changed history. We literally owe a debt of gratitude to Martin Luther as Protestants, whatever branch of Protestantism you may be. You may say, I'm Presbyterian, I'm Baptist, I'm Methodist, I'm Pentecostal, I am whatever, Church of Christ, whatever you may be. You owe a debt of gratitude to Martin Luther. He was the father of the Reformation. He transformed all of Western civilization. The major traditions of the Reformation, you had Roman Catholicism, and you had medieval Christianity, and you had Eastern Orthodoxy. But then, because of the Reformation, you would have Lutheran, you would have Reformed, you would have Anglican, and you would have Anabaptist that would emerge. And we'll talk about those groups more as this season continues forward. Luther's conservative political and economic views arose from his belief that the equality of all men before God applied to spiritual and not just secular matters. While alienating the peasants, such views were a boon to alliances with the princes, many of whom became Lutheran in part because Luther's views allowed them to control the church in their territories, thereby strengthening their power and wealth. By 1530, when a summit conference of Reformation leaders convened in Augsburg to draw up a common statement of faith, leadership of the movement had begun to pass out of Luther's hands. So we're going to see Luther has a lasting influence, and he's to this day has a lasting influence and is literally considered the hero of Germany. But we're going to see over time how things are going to take off. Luther was the catalyst, but we're going to see how leadership is going to begin to pass out of his hands and going to evolve into other leaders. The reformer was still an outlaw and unable to attend the Augsburg conference. The task of presenting Lutheranism fell to a young professor of Greek at Wittenberg. His name was Philip Melanchthon. The young scholar drafted the Augsburg Confession, and it was signed by the Lutheran princes and theologians. But the emperor was no more inclined to conciliation than he had been at the Diet of Worms. After Augsburg, Luther continued to preach and teach the Bible in Wittenberg, but even sympathetic biographers have found it hard to justify some of the actions of his declining years. So, again, Luther has a mixed legacy. And as honest historians, we have to look at it. We can't whitewash over those things, but just about every great man or woman of God you could ever find in the history of, there's some kind of troubling aspect of their life because there are no perfect people. And if God could only use perfect people, none of us could be in ministry. As Time once put it, Luther, he endorsed the bigamous marriage of his supporter, Prince Philip of Hesse. He denounced reformers who disagreed with him in terms that he had once reserved for just the papacy. So he came hard against the Pope, and then now, at times when he disagreed with him, he's going to come hard against fellow Protestant leaders. His statements about the Jews would sound excessive at times, especially by the time of his death in 1546. Biographer Roland Banton said that Luther was an irascible old man, petulant, peevish, unrestrained, and at times positively coarse. So Luther was not refined. He did not mince words. He did not beat around the bush. He was what he called positively coarse. Fortunately, the personal defects of an aging rebel do not in any way detract from the grandeur of his achievement, which ultimately transformed not only Christianity, but all of Western civilization. After 1530, Emperor Charles V made clear his intention to crush the growing heresy. In defense, the Lutheran princes banded together, and in 1531, in the what's called, and you'll have to excuse me on the pronunciation, the Schmalkald League, and between 1546 and 1555, a sporadic civil war raged. So these princes now have adapted and adopted Lutheranism. Now we're going to see political upheaval and even wars that begin. The combatants reached a compromise in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which allowed each prince to decide the religion of his subjects, forbade all sects of Protestantism other than Lutheranism, and ordered all Catholic bishops to give up their property if they turned Lutheran. So this is not, you see over and over again in church history, one group gets another group out of power, and then they become corrupt, and they become the ones that need reform. The effects of these provisions on Germany were profound. Lutheranism became a state religion in large portions of the empire. From Germany, it spread to Scandinavia. Religious opinions became the private property of the princes, and the individual had to believe what his prince wanted him to believe, be it Lutheran or Catholic. Well, I don't want to move in a province or live in a province and be told by the prince of the province that I either have to be Catholic or Lutheran. I want to be what I want to be. Luther's greatest contribution to history, however, was not political, it was religious. So we're going to talk about that more, but understand on the previous program we talked a little bit about the formations of denominations. Denominations came about because these provinces, you had to either be Catholic or Lutheran, and they said, no, I want to follow Calvin, or I want to be an Anabaptist, or I want to be Anglican. These things will evolve, and so we see why these things become what they become. Luther took four basic Catholic concerns and offered invigorating new answers. To the question, how is a person saved? Luther replied, we're saved not by works, but by faith alone. To the question, where does religious authority lie? He answered, not in the visible institution called the Roman Church, but in the Word of God found in the Bible. To the question, what is the church? He responded, the whole community of Christian believers, since all are priests before God. So again, this is the beginning of the concept of the priesthood of all believers, since all are priests before God. And to the question of what is the essence of Christian living, he replied, serving God in any useful calling, whether ordained or lay. To this day, any classical description of Protestantism must echo those central truths, that there is no there is no priestly class that is above the average believer. Nobody is more important as far as getting to God, being able to talk with God because of Jesus, not because of some priestly elite class. So those are the main themes and the lasting influence and legacy of Luther. It is just my personal opinion, and this is just me. I believe Luther may have been in the early stages of dementia when he was getting toward the end, and that sounds offensive probably to some people, but I think because of the way he treated himself physically, I think that he had some long-term problems that were clouding his judgment and clouding his influence. And I think that those things affected his decision making. Some of his papers are very, very strong against the Catholic Church. I mean, I'm sorry, not just the Catholic Church, but against the Jews. And some of his admonitions of how to treat Jewish businesses and how to treat the Jews in Europe, it's very, very anti-Semitic, and it's very problematic. And it's just something that, you cannot gloss over. You cannot, you can't, they're just, he had good things later in his life. I mean, he consolidated the movement of Protestantism. He enjoyed his family life. He married Catherine von Bora, and they had, I can't remember the exact amount, but they had a lot of kids. But he also was very pessimistic. He had very controversial rhetoric. And I think his mental state was marked by his physical state. And so he tried to lead through writing, and he focused on advising and organizing new Protestant churches, and he produced vast amounts of literature. He wrote a translation of the Bible. He translated the Bible into German so that the average person could read it. And he had foundational texts called the Small and Large Catechisms, and he continued to preach at the University of Wittenberg, and he would even fill in for local pastors. But as the Reformation fragmented and what he wanted to see, widespread conversion, it didn't happen. His rhetoric grew increasingly harsh. He began to direct his attacks against the Pope, against rival reformers like the followers of Ulrich Zwingli and the Anabaptists. And then what I've made a little bit of reference to just a while ago, he wrote a treatise called On the Jews and Their Lies in 1543, and he expressed fierce anti-Semitism. He advocated for the expulsion of Jews and the burning of synagogues. Now, that is obviously very, very negative, and that's very running the Jews out of Germany. This would be a mindset that would even be later adapted, and the papers that he wrote even used by the Nazi Party. And I know that's a very strong thing to say, and I know that some people will take umbrage with that. I had one lady who wrote me because I said that on TV one time, and she did not. She said she literally said that I was going to go to hell for talking like that about Martin Luther. I said, lady, I love Luther. I've studied Luther extensively. I admired what he did, but you cannot get past that part of his legacy. It has to be studied. All of that is known, is available through research. So throughout his final decade, Luther struggled with declining health. He had severe headaches. He had gallstones. He had heart problems. In 1546, he traveled to his birthplace of Azovin to mediate a dispute between local nobles. During the trip, his health deteriorated rapidly. He died of a stroke on February 18th of 1546, and his body was transported back to Wittenberg for burial. So that was Luther's life legacy. Again, please don't listen to today and think that I am just being negative about Luther. I'm trying to be an honest historian here. I cannot under or overemphasize how important he was, but we also cannot look past his controversies and his polemics that just called for attacks on fellow reformers and called for attacks on the Jews as part of his legacy. So if you have questions, comments, you agree, you disagree, feel free to email me. You can email me at david.watts@jsm.org, or you can comment on the various podcast platforms. We thank you for tuning in today, and we look forward to next week, and God bless.